So then the knees, we already talked about the knees. Basically, the knees are always soft. Even when I'm back, the knee is not locked. The muscles are soft and relaxed. When the weight is forward, the knee is not locked. There's always a slight bend so that it can easily move from, for instance, this straight and solid, we would call this yang. And as we come back and receive, we would call this yin. Now, we need to be able to move from yin to yang very smoothly. If we locked this back, then there would have to be this moment of unlock, and which would be very energetically very bad and disrupt the energy flow. So you want to keep the knees nice and soft at all times. And making sure that the knees always go in the direction of the toes. The forward foot is pretty easy to be careful of because you can see it. The back foot is a bit harder because it's harder to see it. But it's the same thing. You still want to keep this knee. So when you don't want to let it collapse inward when you're back. You want to keep it outward. When you're moving forward or moving back, it's still going outward. Okay. So that's the information about the knees that's important. Okay. Soft and easy and point in the direction of the toes. The next level up is the hips. Now the hips open and close. When I come back to gather, the hips swing inward and what we call gather or close. There's a buildup in this area of energy in what we call the qua, the hip area. When I move forward, the hips open, expanding, and press out and down. Now, all of these elements, the foot, the knee, and the hip, all work together, as the whole body does, but all these elements really work together, and you can't separate them. In order to gather to the inside, the hip has to close. In order to release from the outside, the hip has to open, you see? So even though we maybe look at each one of these elements separately, it all works together. Now, we talk about the image of screwing energy. It's like having a screwdriver. For instance, if we look at the front foot, when the energy is released backward, it pulls up. It's pulling up into the hip. Then, when I go to thrust forward, it presses down. You see? So here, the energy is pulling into the hips. It's screwing up into the hips. Now here, as the hips open, the energy screws outward. So it comes into the hips and out from the hips, into the hips and out. When it comes in, it goes to the inside of the foot. The knee goes in the direction of the toe. And when you come out, see, if we think about screwing out with this energy, it would be almost impossible to let this knee collapse. If it collapses inwards, you see that here the energy is moving inward. The whole structure collapses. Whereas if the hips open, the knee screws open, it goes in the direction of the toe, it presses the heel down, releasing the energy from the heel. It all works fine. If we just think about this easy screwing the energy coming into the hips and out of the hips. Okay? Okay, so all of these elements are so important to make the base solid, to make the ground, the energy comes up from the base. The energy comes up from the base and moves into the waist and then out. So this is the key to Taiji. In the classics, it always says if you have any problem in the form, look to the legs, and I thoroughly agree. Okay, so pay close attention to these elements. And I'll tell you, it's not only Tai Chi, it's every part of every sport, of every bit of comfortableness, of walking, of movement. If you look at these elements of gather the inside, release from the outside, and opening and closing the hips, you'll notice that it will help to balance the body and to make the body nice and solid, as well as relaxed. Because if the base of support is solid, the top can relax. If the base is tippy, the top gets tight and has to try and hold on, and you lose all that nice, easy sense of relaxation. Okay? So strengthen the legs, pay attention, in putting these elements together. Okay. Now, also in the hips, in thinking about this same principle, the hips, as the hips are opening and closing, the pelvis is slightly tilting up, under, and forward. When we gather, when we come back and gather, the hip slightly tucks under, which adds to the gathering quality of the front. As we release, push out, the hips tend to be tucking under some. So if I were to exaggerate this, when we would come back, we would tuck under. When we move forward, we go this way. So the hips are gently swinging backwards and forwards. There's a release, a slight tilt, and as we come forward, there's a pressure in the back. The buttocks is tucking under, and also the low back is opening here and closing, putting a bit of pressure on the back, straightening the lower back. Here, the lower back is expanding. It's like a bow. And here, the bow is released, the string is released, and the arrow or energy shoots forward. So if we think about a bow and arrow, here the bow, bowstring is pulled back, and then it releases, and the energy shoots forward. So all of this opening in the back, and as we look, the back also expands and contracts. Now all of this is subtle. I'm exaggerating so that you can see it, but it's all happening inside, and it is happening inside. But it doesn't. I think it. Some people's forms you could see they really exaggerate this in order to practice it, and some people get carried away, I think. But in any case, there's this sort of feeling of gathering to the whole back. There's a pressure against the back, and here the energy releases and sort of is pushed outwards and forwards. Here the energy gathers, and here the energy is pushed forward, okay? So in the hips are opening and closing, as well as slightly rocking in and out.